Hey, everybody. Welcome to a show. Doing kind of a different one tonight. So, my guest, Christopher Maute, is here to join me and have a discussion. Probably not too long, but a basic kind of intro to psychology. Because it keeps coming up um, between discussions about pre-sub, apologetics, atheism, theism, and lately some of the trans rights stuff that have come up, between like me and Doug from over at Pine Creek. It's good to kind of get into to psychology a little bit, and it gets kind of an unfair rap, I think. And even though a lot of people who I think a lot of people do get into psychology or get at least a psychology course under their belt when they go to college. Um, not everybody always gets a good one, and a lot of people just don't get to go to college. So, and I think some people, if they can avoid psychology, they will do it. So, anyway, we're going to be talking about that a little bit, and maybe this will turn into something we spring off into later on. But this is just sort of a foundational thing. So, I'm going to quit talking because everybody knows me. I'll let my guest introduce himself and then introduce what he's going to present here. And take it away, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. So some of you may or may not know who I am. My name is Chris Maute, and I've been here so I consider what Jefferson does taking the piss out of people, as well as educating and fighting disinformation. But it seems like the people he likes to take the piss out of, particularly, like Dawkins and Doug from Pine Creek, neither of them like psychology. Don't like it. And based on the arguments that I hear against it, it makes it clear that maybe they're arguing against a version of psychology that's not really psychology, right? And maybe they are arguing, maybe they do understand it, and I misunderstand it. But for the purpose of attempting to clarify, what psychology is, I teach psychology. I manage a laboratory that studies the psychology of the sense of smell. So I'm in the experimental psychology field. I'm a clinical psychology practitioner, right? So you can hear I've already made a distinction between experimental psychology and clinical psychology. And I think clinical psychology is what most people think psychology is. And when they're arguing against it, that's what they're arguing against. And you're probably not going to hear too much of an argument from me about that. What else? I teach intro to psychology at a local university. So the slides that I'm going to be using tonight are slides that I use for class. I am happy to answer any questions that come up in the side chat. Please just go ahead and ask them. Super chat up Jefferson, and he'll read out the questions. And also Jefferson's going to be here asking me questions, like the kinds of questions that may come up, if he were talking to Darth or if he were talking to Doug. And I'll see how well I can answer them, because I do think that one of the best parts about people, they're being critics of science, is the ability for science communicators to be able to handle those questions, not necessarily scientists. Go fuck yourself, Jay. Okay, this is a family show.
I think we're more than a minute into it. I think that's good. I think that's fine. The algorithm doesn't like it if the F words start like within the first minute or three. I think, I can't remember what, but yeah.
Oh, is that right? It's that specific?
Yeah.
Jay's at a promoting and branding. Don't watch this.
That's why I wanted to highlight Jay's so that I could highlight Spookies.
Snooze fest. So I'm gonna try to make it somewhat entertaining. I think psychology is fascinating. I mean, obviously, I am a cheerleader. These slides are geared towards my students being a cheerleader for them becoming psych majors if they're not already. Of course, an intro to psych course is taken by a lot of different majors. It's required for a lot of different majors. So, you'll see what I'm talking about when I start going through what I go through. But again, this is going to be what is psychology, a super basic history of psychology, the difference between experimental and clinical, how psychology is a science, and then legitimate critiques for both the experimental and clinical side of things. And then I'll leave it up to answering questions from there.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
Sound good?
Yeah.
Plan?
All right, I will. Let's change the view here and bring your slides up into the forefront. We probably ought to do that so it's not cutting anything off on the bottom
I'm
left.
very proud of the formatting of my slides.
I like the color fade you got going on. What is psychology?
Yes. I was thinking of spooky bed hair when I was making these. My goal in life is to make spooky bed hair happy. I'm going to say spooky bed hair as often as I can.
You might as well. He is everywhere. I loved it when he was saying like, "Oh, I might be there," and I'm like, "You're an omniscient being. You can't not be there."
You can't not be here. What are you
it's,
doing?
it's the determinism element of being omnipresent.
That's awesome. All right. So I give an example of my calendar for the course. I break the course up into 4 modules. But what is psychology? It is all of these topics. It is brains, bodies, and behavior. That would be biological psychology. It would be sensing, sensation, and perception, consciousness research, development research, research about learning, about memory, about judging or reasoning, anything having to do with intelligence and language, or emotions and motivations, or personalities. And then, of course, the defining and treatment of disorders, and then social psychology. So, all of those things are psychology. Please notice that only one class is dedicated to clinical psychology.
Yeah, what we're going to be in. I mean, I think essentially what this is going to be is an opportunity to audit the first day of class, the first lecture or lecture and a half.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm not going to go deep into the research part because I do drill my students on the research part because I am an experimental psychologist, so my class is a little more science heavy than maybe others are. But I'm not going to let you guys. I'm not going to torture you guys with that. All right. So, introduction to psychology. What is psychology? It is who you are. So, from the perspective of someone like me, all of us are just swimming in a sea of psychology, which I will quickly define as the study of human behavior and experience. I phrase it like that because it helps encompass everything. Behavior are things that are observable, usually, and experience helps encapsulate things like consciousness and perception and the mind and emotions and motivations. So when we phrase it as the scientific study of human behavior and experience, we're able to capture everything that we currently understand of what being human is. And so I pose a problem is, hey, we all have brains, but the problem is our brain is a prediction machine. It did not evolve to give us a true understanding of who ourselves are. And so the solution to this problem is, hey, by taking this class, by learning about psychology, you're also learning about critical thinking. And so in learning about critical thinking, you are applying and learning about a superpower that lets you overcome this intuitive, naive psychology that we all have. And of course, one of the reasons why psychology is important to those of us that think that it is to overcome these everyday psychological myths. And psychological myths are just the kind of folk psychology that are handed down generation after generation with no validity whatsoever, right? And the problem with these common sense explanations is, common sense isn't very common at all. That can be taken 2 different ways, which means common sense, which is the proper application of reason, doesn't happen as commonly as you would think. And then secondly, some things that seem intuitive when you figure out how they work are actually counterintuitive. Second, if we don't apply firewalls like the science of psychology to the things that we experience, then we might fall into traps like after the fact reasoning called hindsight bias, or believing that a false consensus of people believe the same things that we do. And then also basic folk psychology seems contradictory, right? Birds of a feather flock together, but opposites attract. Well, which the fuck is it? You can't judge a book by its cover, but a well-dressed man, like all of these phrases that are completely contradictory to each other. So how do you overcome these psychological myths, this folk psychology? It is with the science of psychology. Again, psychology being the study of behavior and experience. I go into like the origin of the words, some philosophical themes. I like to think of psychology, and my friends get mad at me. So if Simus is in, if either Simus or Fabio end up watching this, they'll hate me for saying this, but I consider psychology the science of philosophy. But because they hate that, I refine it by saying that psychology is the science of philosophy of mind. That seems to make them less angry at me. So I'm going to stick with that one.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think that's pretty good.
Yeah, but they like to bust my balls because they're like more engineer and physics oriented. So
Sure. Yeah.
when they think philosophy, they think that.
What is matter? Never mind. What is mine? No matter. That kind of, yeah.
Thank you. So answering most succinctly, what is psychology? For me, psychology breaks down into two categories, experimental and clinical. 2/3 of people who self-identify, self-label, have degrees in psychology are in the clinical counseling category, whereas the rest of us are in the experimental category. To be even more explicit, experimental psychologists are people doing research in developmental psych, learning and motivation, cognitive psych. That would be the area that I work in. Also sensation and perception, biology, evolutionary psych, and then social cross-cultural psych. I do want to point it out that social psychology is a subcategory of psychology itself. That's going to come up to be important in a little bit. Excuse me. And then, of course, clinical psychology is either helping individuals or helping providers or organizations. You will be quizzed on this. So just to review, psychology is the study of human behavior. The problem is our brain is a prediction machine, not an accuracy machine. And the solution to overcome the fact that our brain isn't meant to show us our true selves is to build a superpower skill set to overcome our intuitive, naive psychology. What I'm essentially asking is for you to, when you think of an idea, think of the validity as passing through your intuitive sense and rising up past intuition up to cognition. Another way of thinking about this in psychological terms is think less in system 1 thinking and spend more time in system 2, more deliberate thinking. Again, it's basics of critical thinking. So this super duper basic history of psychology, for the purpose of having a narrative, I just start with ancient Greece and go, okay, so the Socratic, Platonic way of looking at things has to do with we are born with knowledge, right? We engage in deduction, we look within, it's introspective, whereas Aristotle thinks, hey, you know what? We should trust the sense percepts and use empiricism to gain information. Using that as a rough narrative to cascade over the history of philosophy, we get into the Enlightenment, the Enlightenment, and Descartes also uses introspection in a way that John Locke says we are born blank, tabula rasa, with experience written onto us after we are born. And then we get into actual experiments being done about something called psychophysics. And Ernst Weber is the first person to do it. So what he's looking for and what psychophysics is the most boring thing in the world. It's presenting somebody with a stimulus, marking down their perception, changing the stimulus slightly, marking down their perception, and just doing that over and over again to get like dose response curves or ROC curves, or it's just a tedious way of collecting data. But it was the first attempt to measure perception. So Ernst Weber, for people who are real critics of psychology, I always point to Weber. Psychology is not like physics because it doesn't have laws. It actually does. There's Weber's law. Weber's law got refined to Stevens' principles. The laws of perception as measured by experimental psychologists are as accurate and reliable and predictably so as any other equation in physics for all intents and purposes. So that's what I point to for like the uber critics. But of course, not all of psychology is psychophysics. psychology proper as an experimental field, unlike anything else, and unlike other scientific fields, started at a specific place at a specific time out of nothing, right? Whereas chemistry kind of was born out of naive alchemy, and medicine was kind of born out of naive attempts to be, attempts to heal the body. Psychology kind of went from philosophy to somebody saying, hey, I'm opening a lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879, and it's going to be an experimental psych lab. And boom, experimental psychology existed. And Wilhelm Wundt is the name of the person who opened that field. He had an idea about structuralism, where the constructs of the mind are like pieces of furniture or static objects that we could deconstruct, understand the small parts, and then reconstruct it with a better understanding of it. That sounds intuitively good until you realize the bottleneck of information. You could fill phone books with data using this method and still never be able to really reassemble anything with a lot of clarity. And if you did, it would take a lot of grunt time. William James is considered the father of American psychology. He was like, fuck structuralism. That's not how things work. There are no static objects of the mind. It is a stream of consciousness. And so for that reason, he thought that a functionalist approach would be appropriate. Don't think of a static object that you need to deconstruct. Think of a stream that you're surfing on top of. You might wonder why Darwin is included in a psychology history. I present it like this. In the timeline, Charles Darwin's ideas opened a whole can of worms about how to think of things that were new to the lexicon of thinkers. One of them is there are unseen forces that shape what we currently see and how we currently behave. Of course, this being evolution, natural selection, common ancestry, all of those things, right? That was an invisible force that just nobody thought of. Like, how is it possible that my current behaviors are a factor of these things that happened millions of years ago, if there is such a thing as millions of years ago?
Well, I think maybe for some, I don't know if this was a prevalent thought even in religious circles, but I mean, part of this popped up with, I think with Greco-Roman kind of Hellenistic thinking. There's this sort of idea that you are a soul made in some way, and you are kind of destined to roam this planet in your earth suit, your body, and then whatever happens to you in the afterlife is kind of dependent on how you used your earth suit on the planet during your life. The idea that you're an animal and that your experiences are actually shaped by the world around you in ways that you're not even really totally conscious of. It's got to be kind of a, I mean, if you really kind of think about it, it's almost, if you were shaken from one belief, that first belief, and you now become convinced of the other one, it's almost like finding out that you're a clone or something. It's like, oh, okay. So,
but also think about, to your point, think about what it says about what is accepted at the time, right?
Yeah.
It is a very religious, like, of course, Charles Darwin wanted to go to school for seminary himself, if I remember correctly. But like, it was so religious that, of course, God gave you your life. There was no millions of years ago, right? We're not related to other animals. We are special. Humans are completely different than all other animals. And here comes Darwin, and he's just like, no, we're just a different kind of animal. That was just like mind blowing, or it had to have been at the time. I mean, I remember it was for me, learning about it when I was growing up. It's just like the idea that like everything is connected in the way that it is. Oh my God.
I mean, it's apt. I think it fits.
Oh, he's been getting me with those. Had a lemon cheesecake in my server the other day. Oh, and to kill him. So, unseen forces, an idea kind of brought into the lexicon by Charles Darwin, picked up by Sigmund Freud, right? His deal had to do with the unconscious mind, though. There are these inner workings. It's not evolution. It's this unconscious mind with invisible dynamic forces that are determining our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So this is where psychiatry comes in, because Freud is a medical doctor. trying to treat these things that aren't quite medical things. They are hysteria and neurosis and um, what is it called? What, oh God, I can't think of it, but I'm not going to spend time on it. Things that when you have a psychiatric disorder and you can't feel certain limbs or you go blind, and these are psychophysical, psychosomatic. That's what it is. Psychosomatic symptoms. So
Which,
all of
but
that.
how common is that?
Psychosomaticism.
Yeah.
So for people who nowadays, like the areas of neurosis and hysteria that Freud dealt with, considering that hysteria was pretty much only diagnosed in women.
Funny that, yeah.
Now, oh, well, yeah, well, I mean, that's a whole thing. Like we could talk about World War, what is it? It's either, I think it's World War I. The soldiers came back with PTSD, but the same nurses that fought in the same zone as them, none of them came home with a diagnosis of PTSD or shell shock. None of them came home with the diagnosis of shell shock. They all came home with the diagnosis of hysteria. Well, then why didn't any of the soldiers get diagnosed with hysteria? Well, the soldiers were men. Right. So anxiety, PTSD, trauma, those kinds of diagnoses have like a psychosomatic component to them, where like blindness will occur, or not phantom limb syndrome, because that's actually where a limb is cut off and you feel it, but you'll feel limbs go numb. Exactly.
But it does, yeah. It always used to be a thing when I was a kid. If you were sick or something like that, it was a common thing. Maybe this was just something in the baby boomer generation, or maybe even for Gen Xers, where a kid is sick or something like that, and it was like a go-to thing, like, oh, it's probably just in your head. It's probably psychosomatic. It wasn't until I was much, much older and I realized it actually takes quite a bit to diagnose something as psychosomatic. But as a folk wisdom kind of thing, or a folk psychology thing, it was just this kind of thing. Oh, I'm sure it's just, oh, your stomach's upset. You're probably nervous. Like, no, it was actually that burrito I had yesterday. It's getting worse, yeah.
But also with kids, it's different, right? Because I remember like when I was in like 4th grade, if one kid was allowed to get up and use the faucet, all of a sudden everyone was thirsty and needed to get up and go to like there is some kind of contagion, social contagion that happens, but especially with little kids.
That's
so
true.
Like with psychosomatic, like, yeah, I mean, I can see how little the younger we are, the more we could work ourselves up into thinking that something's happening that's not really. But so leaving off with Freud. So Freud used introspection, right, to get to know your unconscious. William James used introspection to learn about the stream of consciousness. Wilhelm Wundt used introspection to find out about psychophysical principles about perception. There came a point where people who wanted to make psychology a science were like, all that introspection is potentially bullshit, because maybe the mind's just an illusion and behavior deserves all the spotlight. That's when we get into the behaviorist movement of psychology. This is where a lot of the animal models. So if during the first day of class, one of the things I ask my students is, when you think of a psychologist, what's the first thing that you think of? And I usually get 2 buckets of answers. One bucket is the person, the Freudian person smoking a cigar with the client laying on the couch talking about their mother, right? And then the other stereotype is somebody wearing a lab coat working on mice running through a maze kind of thing, right? Behaviorism is why psychology got that second reputation. It's because they thought that the mind is a black box that you can never understand. There's no use trying to understand it when you have all of the richness of behavior in front of you that you could quantify. If you could study behavior, understand what variables in the environment shape that behavior, predict the behavior, then there's no need to know what the animal feels, what the animal's motivations or intents are, right? If you can arrange an environment to make an organism behave however you want, Who cares what's going on between their ears?
Yeah.
That's the basic idea of behaviorism. And its heroes are John B. Watson, popular for the little Albert experiment. For those of you not familiar with that, open a tab, put in little Albert video, and save that for later.
Little
B.F. Skinner, what's that?
Little Albert experiment. Okay.
Yes, little Albert experiment. He essentially tortured a toddler to prove that he could behavioristically change an environment to induce a phobia.
This sounds a little bit like I was thinking about using this image. Do you remember the kind of the opening? It's like the first scene with oh God, why am I blanking on his name? Bill Murray in Ghostbusters, where he's zapping that guy. He's trying to test him for psychic powers. I'm trying to study the effect of negative reinforcement on ESP abilities. And the guy, I'll tell you what the effect is. It's pissing me off. Nice to know Bill Murray's character is just repeating like the little Albert, maybe.
Oh yeah, introducing shocks. Except no shocks were introduced to little Albert. It was a lead pipe that was banged behind him every time little Albert reached for a fuzzy white rat.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and he built a phobia, all right. And with that example, I'm able to demonstrate not only what conditioned stimuli are, but what generalization is, because little Albert ended up being deathly afraid of like everything from any animal with white fur to coats of white fur to masks with a beard of white, like a Santa Claus mask. Like it just generalized to any white hair, freaked out this child.
Oh, poor Albert.
The wonderful history of psychology and all of its crazy experiments. All right. So B.F. Skinner, anybody who has trained dogs or animals or has seen or watched shows about dog training has essentially seen the principles of shaping or operant behavior in place. Yep. And that is Skinnerian classical conditioning. So now we get a little bit more into clinical psychology. So World War I and World War II really shaped the history of psychology, because in World War I, intelligence tests were used to section off the incoming recruits as to what they would be able to do in the army. That's where the alpha and beta tests of the intelligence the Army intelligence tests came from. And also it gave a huge throughput of people taking the intelligence test, so that the standardized normal distribution had lots and lots of people in it, just because it was mandatory for people who were recruited into the Army. So this was a big boost to IQ testing. Also, World War II, World War I and World War II, we had soldiers coming back with shell shock. And we needed to find a way of helping our veterans. Now, after World War II, Freudian psychiatry was still the main mode of therapy, and that was a medical degree. And the United States needed help with their veterans faster than it would take for people to go through a medical program. So clinical psychology programs, 4-year clinical psychology programs, started popping up all over the United States. And then there was an influx of clinical psychologists in the United States. Essentially, it began the boom of clinical psychology. And it was still very Freudian based at the time, but once it became its own thing and not a medical field, that's when also experiments started being done. So, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Also, in World War II, computers were being used a lot more for strategic purposes, and of course, because they were being built, they were being used also as ways of thinking about how the mind worked. So, even though behaviorism was a reaction to introspection, looking at the mind too much, the cognitive revolution was a reaction against behaviorism, because they're like, you know what? With a computer model, we can ask all the right questions to find out more about the mind, even if it's not an exactly perfect model, right? It's that saying, a model doesn't need to be perfect or even accurate to be useful, right? It just might monkey bar you to the next more useful model that leads you to the next more useful model, right? So Chomsky, as well as he's known for his political views, in some stories, the story that I tell in class, because it sounds more interesting, I kind of put it on him as almost single-handedly ending behaviorism, because B.F. Skinner wrote a book about verbal learning. And he was trying to use classical or operant conditioning values, right? And Noam Chomsky was at MIT studying language. He's a linguist, and he was asked to review B.F. Skinner's book. Well, he not only took down B.F. Skinner's ideas, but pretty much the monolith of behaviorism at the same time. He's like, it is ridiculous to think that we learned verbal language according to, behavioristic principles. That would mean that every sentence we currently say had to have been said in the past in the exact same way and reinforced over and over again. What really happens, according to Chomsky, is that we have a limited amount of words and an unlimited way of generating sentences from it. So he considers language a generative process. And he says that we are born, he's a nativist. He thinks that we are born with these things like a language acquisition device that helps us learn language very quickly. So that, of course, means that he's talking about the mind. So in talking about the mind and laying waste to behaviorist approaches, he kind of kicks he kicks the cognitive revolution into place.
So has that been altered at all? I mean, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but
Chomsky's contributions to linguistics are still there. As with all revolutionary theories, it has changed. He was talking about a universal, I believe that he was talking about there was a universal grammar that we derived all of our individual languages from. I don't think that that's taken up anymore. The idea of a language acquisition device was a metaphor. Of course, we're not built with devices in our heads, and currently there's no neuroanatomy to show where specifically that would be.
right.
But he's still, he's so deep into linguistics that his contributions go well beyond my understanding. So his contributions are still valid, but not the language acquisition device, not necessarily the things he was writing about when he destroyed behaviorism.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because that was in like the late 1940s, mid 1950s, I think. And then from there, it was kind of easy. There was psychophysics, right? And then there was psychoanalysis, and then there was behaviorism, and then the cognitive revolution. Well, with the cognitive revolution, now that we're looking at the mind, now we can diversify and specify. Now we can start looking at memory more in a more detailed way. We could start looking at cognition in a more detailed way. Cognition is just a fancy word for thoughts. So when I talk about cognitive therapy, I'm going to be talking about therapy having to do with thoughts. It diversified so that it's not just about learning. It's not just about behavior. It's not just about psychophysics. Now it's about consciousness. It's about intelligence. It's about personality. It's all those things that I showed at the beginning of the slides, which I'm showing here. So from the cognitive revolution, psychology branched out into all these other fields. So in answering what is psychology, all of these things are psychology. And that was and then just wrapping it all up, the truly painful, super basic history of psychology is that it goes from mind to behavior, back to mind with behavior. And I use the analogy of a pendulum. Just imagine the pendulum starts at being concerned with the mind and then swinging towards being concerned with behavior, then being concerned with the mind again. And now it's kind of settling in between with a focus on both cognition and behaviors, knowing that both of them are as valuable.
Gotcha.
So that is the answer. If I were to answer the question, what is psychology? That would be the end of that answer. So you think I should stop and see if there's any questions?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, if anybody's got any questions, feel free to, at me or, go ahead and put them to my attention because Matt, I don't know if you're actually in the live chat, Matty.
So. I am. So Wilberforce has a chronic stress and HPA axis question.
Let me see. Yes.
Mm.
I still want to pick Maudi's brain on chronic stress and the HPA axis. What is the HPA axis, I guess?
The HPA axis is so there's a part of your brain. This is the inner part of your brain as compared to the outer part. So your brain kind of looks like a walnut. The part that looks like the wrinkled part is the outer part. That's the cortex. The HPA axis is the hypopituitary adrenal axis, if I remember correctly. So it has to do with your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, and that controls your endocrine system, which controls your cortisol. And cortisol is released during stress. And so the question that was asked was chronic stress, which means a sustained amount of cortisol in your system, which is unhealthy, right? So let's think of this as the anti-fragile analogy. For people who have short bursts of regular stressors throughout their life, right, where cortisol just kind of bursts in their system, does its function, and then, goes away, that strengthens the immune system, right? That makes it anti-fragile, these normal short bursts. Abnormally long, sustained periods of time where you have high levels of cortisol being released is actually detrimental because it's meant to be a short period of time readiness hormone. But when it's in your system for a long period of time, the consequences are a little bit different. You start retaining weight in different ways. You start having worse sleep. So chronic stress and the HPA axis are connected in that the HPA axis is responsible for releasing cortisol. Chronic stress is responsible for a steady state of cortisol that is higher than your regular free cortisol should be. So that's the relation between the two of them. Now, that would be the answer to the question. If there's another question connected to that, I'll try to give any information I can. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Wilberforce said, does Maudie think the connection is partly responsible for the increase in people, quote unquote, snapping in modern times, despite overall violent crime dropping?
I don't know. I don't have any evidence for people snapping. I mean, is he as compare if by snapping, are you referring to the uptick in like gun violence and like events of violence? Or you consider those snapping as compared to just regular?
Maybe he's talking about like issues of people like road rage incidents that aren't necessarily violent, or those videos of like angry Karens screaming at somebody at a 7-Eleven, that kind of thing. That's
See, I don't know if there's an uptick in them. I think that there's an uptick in
the recording.
My rule of thumb is like they've stayed the same, but our exposure to them has upticked.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, that would. I mean, I would think that that's probably more likely.
And if there's evidence to the contrary, I'd love to look at it.
Because well, if you look at movies done in the 80s, throughout the 70s and 80s, and you look at like, obviously they're movies, but they're trying to, some movies are at least trying to get dialogue and interactions to mirror what's going on in real life. If you look at the way people were trying to mirror like something like, say, a good example is mid to late 80s cop movies or shows where the cops are constantly yelling at each other. Now, it probably didn't help that all the characters were on a steady diet of cigarettes and booze, which both
and coffee.
and coffee, all of which are like jacking the cortisol levels up and keeping them there forever. I think that they were probably snapping all the time, but you just have to do it. You have to find ways to let it steadily vent as opposed to giving one event.
Yeah. It's like all I can think of is what was the Mel Gibson, Danny Glover movies? Lethal Action?
Lethal Weapon. Yeah.
Lethal Weapon. Yeah, I'm getting too old for this shit. Yeah, that is too much cortisol for too long a period of time. Danny Glover's character. I'm getting too old for this shit. His system is jacked. He's had a lifetime of not enough sleep.
Yeah.
Horrible coping mechanisms. And a job that is super stressful. All right. So anything else?
Let's see. Nope. Just a bit of criticism here.
Yeah.
How dare you disparage cigarettes and booze? That's what keeps my stress down. Well, that was directed at me. So no problems there.
Hey,
All
Dr.
right.
Tapioca Weasel is here. Dr. Tapioca Weasel, I believe, was in a hangout with my buddy Mark Reed. And I think that he might have had some questions about psychology, but I'm not going to force him to ask them because he just got into the chat.
He's saying science is fake and truth is a lie. Sounds like a pre-supper just showed up here. No, I met him over on Maya's channel for a few weeks back. Jeff asked my earlier question. I think what was his earlier question?
It was snarky, is what
It
it was.
was. Yeah, it was snarky. Um,
Cortisol in Trump's brain.
oh, his last one. Can Maute speculate how much cortisol Trump's brain, I use the term loosely, is producing these days?
Oh man,
Well,
I think
fortunately,
that he's so deluded.
he's never been a drinker, so at least he's got that going for him. But
True. Oh, let's tell everybody about the conversation we had right before we went live.
oh yeah, so I had to admit that, because it's in the news, people, there are actually people waiting in Georgia for Donald Trump to arrive and turn himself in, and he is doing
Why?
that. And
Why? I mean, why is it? I mean, it is of course important because Donald Trump is turning himself in. But what
for
else is going
me,
on?
for me, it's the fact that they require an intake form, and they do not let you report this information. They take height and weight, and they make it public. So we will get Donald Trump's actual recorded height and weight, not what he's put out to fans and stuff. So, and I'm just petty enough.
Oh,
Well, I
me
think
too. I'm right
fans.
there with you, dude.
I can't wait to see it because he's thrown out so many numbers with so many weird ratios as we were talking about before. You're like, I'm
Yeah.
6'4" and 220 pounds. I'm like,
Not
no, you
on Earth.
like
No.
you would look like my nephew with a little bit of a paunch. Like, there's no way. I've seen you in tennis shorts. You're at least 275. Like, there's no way you're not 270. Yeah, yeah, you're going north. I'm
North.
keeping it. I'm keeping it as conservative as I can until I hear the height. But I will question my ability to like evaluate the human shape of anyone if they come back and like, oh, he's only 235 pounds and he's 6'1". I'll be like, what? Because Rudy Giuliani came back. They said his height is 5'11". He weighs 230 pounds. And I'm like, that makes sense.
If it came back, yeah.
But if they say,
5'11".
yeah, if Trump comes back as like 230 pounds and he's like 6 foot even, I'm like, okay, so you're saying he's 1 inch taller than Giuliani and the same weight? I'm
First of
calling
all,
BS.
he will throw a fit if they report anything less than 6 feet.
Yes, he will.
Anything less than 6 feet. That's hilarious.
Michael said they allowed him to self-report height and weight. He said he was 215.
Get out of here, 215.
No. No.
Hey, Dr. Tapioca Weasel already said something fantastic. Find the Indeed. Put that up there.
Indeed, yeah, I just got here, but I will defend psychology as a science, albeit one of the most difficult ones. All right.
Got that right. Got that right.
Okay, let's push on with the slides. Everybody loves slides.
I love slides. Slides make life easy. So, in teaching about psychology, of course, teaching about psychology and teaching that psychology is a form of critical thinking. I, of course, teach the scientific method and teach psychology as adhering to the scientific method. Of course, psychology is a science. It is a soft science, absolutely. But a science nonetheless that still goes through all of the hypothesis testing, theory generation, and risky predictions that all scientific theories have to go through. Psychology is different, obviously, because of the history, whereas other sciences gradually worked their way up out of amateur versions of the field. Psychology kind of started fresh, 1879, Leipzig, Germany. Also, because psychology is about humans, we have an ethical component that chemists and physicists don't necessarily have to worry about. But we do have to realize that when Karl Popper was talking about falsifiability, the line of demarcation to determine science from pseudoscience, he uses Freudian psychoanalysis as the prototype of pseudoscience. So psychology doesn't get out of this scot-free, right? Because Freud is considered psychology, but he's not considered an experimental psychologist. So the critique that Popper has is for the pseudoscience that is Freudian psychoanalysis. That is not a critique of psychology proper. It is a critique of one member of the history of psychology. But falsifiability is a criteria that psychological scientific theories have to go through. And then, of course, the hierarchy of evidence. At the very bottom, you can start with anecdotal reports and then move up to systematic observations. The higher up to go, the more valid they become. And then case studies looking at a very particular person or population, and then uncontrolled outcome studies, random controlled trials. And then when a bunch of RCTs are done, you can throw them into a meta-analysis to see what the power of the main effect is across a bunch of different laboratories. So just like all other science, this is the hierarchy of validity used in psychology. And replicability is important because if all of those randomized control trials show completely different results, then the meta-analysis is going to show that the result isn't replicable. Whereas if the random control trials all kind of skew towards a certain direction reliably and predictably, well, then the meta-analysis is probably going to kick out a result showing a higher effect for whatever the phenomenon is. Now, remember replicability, and remember how I distinguished social psychology from psychology earlier. Wait for it. Statistics. In psychology, in my lab, we use statistics all the time, both descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. Descriptive statistics are just like how many males and females were tested, what was the age, what was the blah, 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 like just the basic demographic information of who we test fits into descriptive psychology. Inferential psychology talks about probabilities. And here's where behavioral statistics comes in. Fun fact, the main test used in behavioral stats is an ANOVA, which is just ANOVA stands for analysis of variance. And it's looking at two different populations to see if they're significantly different from each other. This analysis of variance is a beefed up version of what's called a student's t-test. And the student's t-test was originally formulated by somebody working for the Guinness Brewing Company who was working on yeast strains, because in order to ensure quality control, they wanted to make sure their yeast strains didn't deviate from the standard too much. So they would have to have group A and group B, and they would have to have a criteria for determining when the two populations were significantly different from each other. But because the person wouldn't be able to own the patent or something like that, or because he wasn't allowed to publish as a worker for Guinness, he submitted it under the name student. So that's why in some books it's still called a student's t-test. So Guinness beer is responsible for the basic t-test that the analysis of variance behavioral statistics is born out of. Nerd. Talking about clinical psychology. So like that's all of the science that I talk about, that I'm going to talk about tonight. I want you to keep in mind the replicability bit, because that's going to be a problem that I bring up in a little bit. Now we move on to clinical psych. Here's just a basic infographic talking about prevalence. And this is dated. This is maybe 8 years old. This was pre-COVID. So I have a feeling that the numbers have shifted a little bit. But it's interesting to observe. Less Black adults had prevalence of any mental illness over the past 12 months than white adults, but mixed adults have even more than white. It's interesting to look at the breakdown. So this, right, remember the slide I just showed, descriptive versus inferential statistics? This infographic has descriptive statistics. These are all descriptive stats. So when we talk about clinical psych, the reason why clinical psychology exists, it is to help treat or solve a problem. And the problem used to be labeled as abnormal psychology, abnormal behavior. And the criteria for what is abnormal is posited by the American Psychiatric Association. And it says that a mental disorder is a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior. You can already see a problem with this because who determines what is a clinically significant disturbance? Depending on what disorder you're talking about, that might be a little bit more clear-cut than others. The 4 standards that I talk about in class about that are criteria used for determining abnormal behavior are the statistical standard, the moral standard, the harm standard, and the unhappy standard. The statistical standard, the best example of that is what used to be called mental retardation, which is now called intellectual disability. This is a score on an IQ test. So if you look at a normal distribution, if your score is 70, you are considered borderline ID, intellectual disability, and everything below that on that end of the bell curve, statistically speaking, puts you in a more severe category of intellectual disability. But that's not necessarily how it works in all the other categories of disorders. The moral standard would be you have a disorder that would be frowned upon, that enacting on it would be frowned upon by the moral standards of society. These change, so the moral standard isn't a hard and fast beacon of criteria that could be used. There's the harm standard, which is, does the disorder potentially cause harm to the person themselves or anyone in their surrounding environment? And then there's the unhappy standard, which is essentially the quality of life standard. If this is not a problem for anybody except you, it's still a problem because your quality of life should be of the utmost importance, so long as your disorder is not causing harm to others or violating moral standards, right? But somehow you're still unhappy. That's a valid enough reason to pursue treatment. And the point that I make at the bottom here is these 4 different standards are combined and mixed to help reduce errors in diagnosis, not get rid of them. The process of diagnosing mental disorders is not, I bet Darth would say it's 170. The process of diagnosing is not a science, right? Depending on the disorder, there are inventories and questionnaires that you can fill out, and there is a whole cottage industry of those and them getting validated and standardized. But depending on the disorder, it might be very difficult to get agreement and consistent and a consensus on what the problem is and what the treatment should be. Now, in America, we use something called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And this is like the encyclopedic zoo of human beings, is what I kind of describe it as. If you were to open it and look at any of the disorders, some people might be convinced that they have many of the disorders that are in there when they actually don't. And it's because it's a categorical approach, and there's a problem with categorical approaches. Some people could fit in more than one category. Some conditions are labeled, there are too many conditions labeled as mental illnesses to really kind of capture what a problem is for the purposes of treatment. So an alternative to having very strict buckets and categories of you have bipolar or you have generalized anxiety disorder is to have a continuous variable such that of variables like depressed mood, anxiety, violent temper, substance abuse, and thought disorder, you're rated on a continuum so that it's not you're depressed or you're anxious. Hey, some people who with depression also have anxiety. So there was a critique about diagnosing that the DSM, the current book that we use, the current system that we use is flawed because categories themselves are flawed. You can see this reflected in the new ontake of spectrums. Spectrum disorders are now a little bit more popular, and that's where you're placing something on a continuum. And that idea of it not being buckets and categories, but rather existing on a continuum is being embraced more and more. All right. So now here's a real quick story time. Here is some really bad evidence, good evidence, but bad for psychology, of just how clinical psychology is not a science, right? So, for instance, Jeff, in your talk with Doug, he brought up something like, if a Republican counselor and a Democratic counselor all saw the same client, do you think that they would come out with different results? Do you remember when he said that?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So even though, like, I don't think that clinicians or counselors break down or are stratified according to political alignment, Doug does have a point in that it has been demonstrated that a moment ago when I said that, diagnosing people is not a science, that has been exploited to show that it's really not accurate. So this guy on the left smoking the pipe, his name's Dan Rosenhall, and he sent students to psych wards, to psych hospitals, and had them feign the symptoms of schizophrenia to get in, only to wait a week and then tell the guards what the deal was. Hey, I'm actually a student. I faked all my symptoms to get in. I don't actually have schizophrenia. Let me out. Well, it took some convincing once they were in order for them to get out. And after and there's more to this. So what he thinks this demonstrates is diagnoses are so inaccurate that if you act well enough, you can just fake it, right? So if you can just act your way through a disorder, how bad of a disorder is it, right? And he was also kind of lambasting the fact that once somebody labeled you as schizophrenic, their confidence level was so high that you trying to convince them that they were wrong to begin with is a monumental task.
Yeah.
Even when the people were released, they weren't released because they were signed off as sane. They were released because the people who diagnosed them said that they were in remission, meaning that they still thought that they had schizophrenia, but it wasn't affecting their world anymore.
Right.
So when this came out, a bunch of people who were running hospitals were like, that would never happen to me, blah, blah, blah. So this is a follow-up. So this guy goes, all right, so over the next 6 months, I'm going to send out a bunch more stooges, and, we'll see if the people who think that they're better than the hospital that I used are any better. Well, 6 months later, the people who, the heads of these hospitals, they're like, oh, I have this many people that we think are this many people, blah, blah, blah. He didn't send anybody out. So he proved his point again, right? First, he didn't tell them what he was doing and showed that he could fake people getting in by faking the symptoms. And then second, he primed them to think that people were faking it by not sending anybody, but everybody knowing that he had faked it in the past. So this is used by a lot of people to demonstrate the inefficacy of diagnosing in psychology. And the person on the right-hand side is Thomas Zaz, and his book, The Myth of Mental Illness. He is a pretty hard-hitting critic, also a psychiatrist trained in the field of diagnosing. Now, the one critique I'm going to lay at the bed of this particular phenomenon is they went to a hospital, a psych hospital. If you go to a regular if I drink a pint of blood and walk into an emergency room and puke up that blood, they're going to treat me like I have a stomach ulcer or, problem, right? Because I'm going to a hospital and their goal is to treat emergencies and believe you from the get-go. When you go to a psych ward, it's kind of the same thing. You're there for an emergency, right? This isn't a doctor visit. They're not observing you in natural environments. You're coming. This is a self-selected group of people that are coming to them because they have a problem, right? So the framing isn't as neutral as an environment that is controlled, different people looking at the same person who might be maligning or not over a period of time to determine whether or not malingering is the word I meant to use.
Malingering, yeah.
So that's a legit critique. There are some diagnoses that it is difficult to get a consensus on, but between the team of people that you're working with, depending on what the problem is, you would like to think that second and third opinions are gotten and a strategy is put in place to increase the quality of life of the person of interest. Now I'm just going to blast through the rest of these. This slide just shows the difference between treatment in the 50s versus now.
Sorry to interrupt, but just do you want to address this question since it was a couple segments back? What are the examples of moral standards that was in that stack of 4 that you had a few slides back?
The example I give for that is homosexuality. There was a time when it was considered immoral to be homosexual, and it was a diagnosable disorder that required treatment. Right. So at one time, being homosexual was immoral. That moral standard has changed such that it is no longer in the DSM as a diagnosis. It is embraced in ways that it has never been in the United States, so like that moral standard, that would be a moral standard. And that would be an example of how that moral standard has changed over time, hence making moral standards by themselves not a very good criteria.
Yeah.
Criterion. Isn't that singular?
Criterion, yeah, singular. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is looking at, psychoanalysis versus behavior therapy versus cognitive therapy versus person-centered therapy. And admittedly, the person-centered therapy and the psychoanalysis are where clinical psych get their real critics, because psychoanalysis is crazy Freudian shit, and person-centered therapy is the warm, fuzzy sweater, unconditional positive regard. It's the one that like Stuart Smalley kind of makes fun. I'm okay and you're okay.
Do not shit all over yourself. All that good stuff. Yep.
Yeah, all that good stuff. And so the efficacy of therapies, they all seem to be pretty equally effective as far as the research done on them. More recent research is showing cognitive behavior therapies to be kind of standing out, but that's because of a bunch of different factors. Cognitive behavior therapies don't have you go into your past, so they can be used short term, right? So just think about it. If I have to know about your history to know why your problem today is a problem, that's going to take a lot of time. If, on the other hand, you and I just accept that you have a problem and we're going to work on the obstacles that are getting in the way of you achieving your goals, well, that might only take 4 or 5 sessions. That is kind of the cognitive behavioral approach. And because of that, it gets more funding for research. And because of that, it gets more evidence as being evidence-based and researched. Admittedly, it is much easier to do research on things like cognitive behavior therapy because there are very specific homework, assignment, and assessments that can be given, right? Because it's cognitive behavioral therapy, there are behaviors that can be quantified and observed. Because it's cognitive, there are questionnaires that can be filled out so that you can, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you? And then keep checking that over time to see whether or not it changes. So it is a very data-driven way of doing therapy.
Yeah.
Which I like. I like what's called the third wave of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is called, which includes mindfulness and stuff.
Yeah.
And so this is my last slide, just pretty much saying, speaking of clinical psychology, if anybody is in duress, there are opportunities to talk to somebody, it is ubiquitous, the ability to talk with people anymore. So there's no shame in the game of seeing a counselor. If you hurt your foot, you would see somebody who works on feet. If you had a heart problem, you'd see a cardiologist. If you have thoughts or feelings that are decreasing your quality of life, talk to somebody who specializes in it. It's that simple.
Yeah.
So to me, that is psychology. Now, the one critique that I didn't really spend time on that I'm about to right now is the replication problem. And you can go back to, I don't have any more slides. The replication problem is specific, it's not specific. Psychology has a replication problem. That is, a lot of the research that comes out in the psychology field, specifically social psychology, it has been shown that you can't replicate it. They're not easily replicated. Now, is that a problem? It depends on where you're coming from. as somebody who is a fan of psychology and a science communicator, I'm thinking long term. The inability to replicate things now is the self-correcting process of science that in the long run will only allow the theories that are robust and replicable to last. So that's my position of it. In the short term, it looks horrible because people who I look up to, like Dan Ariely, who wrote a book. Welcome back, babe. The Oracle of the Couch just got back home. So, like, I'm a big fan of Dan Ariely. He wrote a book called Predictably Irrational. He talks about cognitive biases. He's kind of doing the behavior economics thing that was started by Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for economics, even though he's a psychologist. Dan Ariely has been shown to fudge his data. It's not replicable. And it's not replicable to the point where they did an audit of his research and it shows that he's fudging things. Be wary. What can I tell you? Be wary of people who think that they have their finger on the pulse of how everyone thinks. Stop making gurus out of people that know more than you. Like, when you do that, you're going to build somebody up just to make it higher of a cliff for them to fall from.
Yeah.
You know, if we just understand that, well, psychology especially has a very human interest, right? Like, everything we talk about is you and how to improve you and how to understand others around you, right? Because it taps into everything that we do. Psychology is prone to have like bullshit gurus, I think, more than other fields. I think medicine is under psychology, in my opinion. Like, you know, because psychology is known for all the self-help books.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I think that's probably that's probably my biggest complaint about the kind of popular consensus about it. I don't think that enough people realize that there's because I think people would be more interested in sort of the neuro stuff if it's something kind of coming out at the very least sounding like hard sciences, like we studied the brain and we found it's wired to love chocolate or candy or whatever, and like, oh, that's cool. You know, if a clinical psychologist is telling somebody, you know, and like, yeah, most of the patients that I talk to love candy, everybody's like, what a quack, what an idiot, of course everybody loves candy. You know, it's really weird, sort of the divide between it.
But also, like, when somebody's out there saying power poses make you more confident if you just stand with your hands on your hips with your feet 2 feet apart,
right.
It's like, that doesn't pass the smell test.
Yeah.
But like, that person, Amy Cuddy, I think her name is, she got crazy attention to the point where like big businesses reach out to people with these ideas. And the next thing you know, you're surrounded by people that are just like, yes, that's a fantastic idea. And you should do TED Talks. And once you've done a TED Talk, then shit, you should be making a lot more money doing speeches. And once you're making a lot of money doing speeches, you should be writing a book. God damn, you wrote a book. This has to be true. And,
yeah. And then
2 years later, it's like, oh, this was worked out on a cocktail napkin at a bar, you know, like.
Yeah. And even then, I think, you know, there might have been somebody during that conversation at that bar is like, "No, come on, that's never going to fly." Yeah. And then, you know, 12 months later, they're like looking back, like, "Well, I'd be damned, that's a bestseller, huh? Who knew? We should have stolen that napkin."
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But
I got a question.
It would be nice. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. Finish your point.
I was just gonna say, it would be nice if things were as empirical. And so one of the things that Doug did when talking to you, excuse me, was talk about, like, he tried to compare, you know, like a psychological diagnosis with cancer, which is empirically observable. It's like, you know, my argument to that is, psychology currently is built on the structure of the medical model, but the medical model doesn't really apply as well to psychology as it does to medicine, because when you're dealing with psychology, you're dealing with things that you can't see. That is the very elusive nature of dealing with psychological matters, is that, yes, compared to physics, it's not as reliable. It is a soft science. Yes, compared to looking at cancer, it is not empirical, but it's still the best that we have. And if we were to get rid of psychology, what would you replace it with? What other science of experience exists, right? So you can take it as flawed, and the flaws are features of self-corrections instead of glitches that disqualify, right? Because again, compare it to the alternatives, not to the almighty. Could it be better? Absolutely. Compared to what, though? Okay, let's imagine you're right. It's not reliable. It's a soft science. It's not empirical. I'm going to grant all of those things. Now what? You still have people with these problems that we can't see, right? So we have to listen to what they're saying. We have to observe their behaviors. We have to have a system for categorizing and systematizing our observed behaviors and what people say to help.
Yeah.
So,
all right.
That's my TED Talk.
Well, thanks. I'm going to start laying out some questions for anyone that's. And this one was from AJ Maute. I'm fairly certain Jordan Peterson is a quack outside of psychology. What do his fellow psychologists think of him?
JP. I tried to give JP a chance. And unfortunately, he got caught by, what do they call that? Not capture, crowd capture.
Crowd capture? Cancel culture?
No, it's something capture where like he's like, he was in a certain flux of things where his opinion was determined by the audience that he captured with his ideas.
Oh, yeah. No, yeah, I understand what you mean. I can't think of the term either, but it's something
captured. I can't get loose, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. But I think that he got caught up. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was the wrong person at the wrong place at the wrong time. He is a bit of a self-serving, self-important character, and always has been, keeping in mind he's had thousands of hours of videos up before he was popular. He just wanted to put output. He just wanted to put content out there. So he's a bit of a character. He's well-versed in personality. He's well-versed in Jungian psychology. He is a licensed, maybe not for long, clinical psychologist. All of those things I have to give him credit for. But he talks about everything outside of those areas with the same confidence that he has inside those fields. And that's his downfall. Like, I don't give a shit what he thinks about geopolitics. I don't give a shit about what he thinks about trans issues. I don't give a shit about what he thinks about the size of women on Sports Illustrated. I'm just not interested in those opinions from him. And some of them, I'm not interested in those opinions from anybody. But Jordan Peterson, he's legitimately done research in personality. He is licensed clinical psychologist. Again, maybe not for long. So in those areas, I like listening. I love listening to his Jungian takes on fairy tales and stories of the Bible. I think that they're fascinating to listen to from that Jungian lens, from that Joseph Campbell kind of, hero of a thousand faces kind of way of looking at things. But when he starts going off about everything else, like, why is he on Daily Wire? Like, who in the Daily Wire audience is interested in psychology? Nobody. So he doesn't talk about psychology as much. So that's my take on JP.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, sorry about that. I don't know if it's still live or not, but my power went out 3 times in a row.
No.
Yeah. The storms have moved in. I don't know if it's still, is it still live right now? It is still live. Okay. I can't tell because nothing on my laptop will let me do that. The hotspot wouldn't kick over for whatever reason, so I apologize for that.
No worries.
But
well, hopefully it kept going.
Yeah, no, I just switched over to my phone, so we can keep this going for a little bit, and then
okay.
Yeah, I don't know, what did that sound like after? Like,
no, it just didn't sound like anything. It just put me in the center, and then it was quiet.
Yeah. Okay, that's kind of what I thought.
So hopefully that worked.
Cellular's fine, but yeah, no, it's really driving. I mean, it was sprinkling before, but now it's just really gusting, and we're getting lightning and thunder the whole bit. So
that's awesome.
This was kind of predicted, but not really. But yeah. But yeah, no, I wasn't. So I guess I'm going to have to wrap it up here, unfortunately, because I don't know that I can. Eventually, this is going to go out again.
I'm
But
happy to talk about psychology anytime. If anybody is out there who wants to talk psychology above and beyond what we talked about today, just get in touch with me. It's super easy to do.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Now I'm getting weather warnings over my phone. That's great. Okay. I'm going to get out of here before I get electrocuted in my chair.
I'm in the basement.
I wish there was. This is just in my apartment. This apartment's pretty sturdy, but apparently the power lines around here are not. So, sorry, Chris. This would happen, and we decided to do something educational. My building keeps getting struck by lightning. It's the wrath of God.
Perfect. It's exactly right. How dare you? Either.
We talk about psychology, and this is when it hits. Like all those times with. Oh my Lord.
We must prevent this information from getting out.
Yeah, it's getting bad. I think I'm going to head into the basement. So,
all right, man. Well, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank everybody in the side chat for contributing.
Thank you, everybody in the side chat, for contributing. Thank you, Maute. We will do this again. Sorry, folks, to cut this short, but I've got to run for my life, apparently. So I will catch you all later.
Be safe.
Climate change is real, folks. Take care.
That's awesome. All right. Be safe, dude.